This is Mahon Chapter 3, and this is about epidemiology and public health. And this is used with permission from Carrie Brophy Martinez from Austin Community College. Epidemiology is the study of the occurrence, distribution, and causes of disease and injury. And there's a lot in the news about epidemiology, and the purpose is to study the course or history of disease, determine the frequency of disease, identify patterns of disease, identify risk factors, potential causes, and evaluate the effectiveness of preventive measures. So with the recent coronavirus in 2020, epidemiology is in the news quite a bit and is very helpful. General concepts of public health. The laboratory is very important in this process because we identify the isolates. We have to determine specimen contamination rates, or so is this contamination or is it a real pathogen? We have to determine the number of isolates per site and the number of isolates per hospital unit. So this would be for tracking, say, a bacteria that could be growing in water. Like I think there was one that was traced back to water that was growing a fungus in an ICU unit. And also there's a story, a factual story in the news about a multi-drug resistant Klebsiella strain that was found in the water system at a hospital, a government hospital, as a matter of fact. So we use these things, these epidemiology studies, to improve patient care. We are also looking for the prevalence of bacteria, isolates, the influence of antibiotic choices, and the prevention of to build up antibiotic resistance, especially in units or facility. And what we do is the laboratory, microbiology laboratory, provides something called an antibiogram for physicians at every hospital. And what that is, it's a list of the commonly used antibiotics and the commonly found pathogens. And those antibiotics are known to work. And so what we're looking for is those pathogens that are showing a divergence from working with those antibiotics. This chapter is mostly about learning terms. So carrier is a person or animal who harbors and spreads microorganisms that cause disease. The person does not become ill. An example would be Typhoid Mary. And this is such an interesting case. I put a link here for us. So we'll see, I'll show you what this looks like here. Typhoid Mary, villain or victim. So basically, this is a story about Typhoid Mary, who had was carrying typhoid fever, the typhoid organism, and she knew she had it, but she was a chef, and that was her means of making a living, and so she knew that she had it. And she had no other way to make a living, so she had to felt like she had to keep cooking, and she was isolated, and it's a very interesting story if you want to take the time to read that. So I highly recommend that you look up Typhoid Mary and read about her. It's very interesting. The next term is reservoir. A reservoir is the source of infection. It's a site where the pathogen can multiply or survive until it's transferred to the host. This can be a living organism, non-living organisms, or materials. For example, people, animals, or environmental elements, and also fomites. That's spelled F-O-M-I-T-E, and that's an inanimate object like a phlebotomy tray or countertop that can be a source of contamination. Next terms that after 2020 we are all familiar with. Endemic is an organism or disease that is constantly present in a population. Example, cholera in third world countries. An epidemic is a disease that affects a significantly large number of people at the same time in one geographic area. For example, the West Nile virus in 2002 in the United States. And then a pandemic is a worldwide epidemic. So examples would be the swine flu and then more recently COVID-19. The incidence rate is the number of times a new event occurs in a given period. Usually this is given as cases per 100,000 or 1,000 per population. The incubation period is the time between exposure to a pathogen and the onset of symptoms, and this can be anywhere from, seconds to weeks, and we are familiar with this. The index case is the first case of a disease which serves as a source of infection. And if you want to research this, the research and reporting on the incidence case of HIV in the United States is very interesting. We've seen a lot of these. Epidemiologists like to communicate their findings with charts and graphs. So we can see this is for patients with Acinetobacter in an intensive care unit. So on day 4, they noticed that there was one patient, and then another patient on day 6, another on day 7, and on day 9 there were 2 patients, and then on day 11 they probably thought, hey, wait a minute, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 patients within 7 days that have come in contact or have an Acinetobacter infection, so something is going on. And so they did an infection control intervention. And this is something that there are actually laboratory scientists now that work on the infection control team in hospitals. It used to be just nurses, and it's wonderful to have a laboratory scientist on that team because they really understand about bacterial growth and antibiotic interactions. Here's another curve, an outbreak of diarrhea at the state fair. So this is a really more interesting. So the fair started on day 1, and then on day 3 after the fair, it looks like about 10 people had diarrhea. And then after the fair had been in town a week, wow, 150 people. And then the fair ended and the diarrhea went away. Wow. But this is something fun and exciting and interesting that epidemiologists look at. All right, so why are we interested in epidemiology and what can it tell us? So it's going to tell us the morbidity rate, and that is the rate at which the illness occurs. The mortality rate is the number of deaths caused by a disease in a certain population. And then surveillance is collection of data pertaining to disease of occurrence. And there is a weekly report generated by the Centers for Disease Control called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And so you can follow this link or just search for the MMWR, and it's very interesting to read. When it gets time to do case studies or a report, this would be an excellent place to look as a resource. Surveillance and reporting. So something that we have to do in the laboratory is reporting. So there are certain diseases that are required by law to be reported to public health authorities. There's a whole long list of them. So for example, syphilis has to be reported. So we would, the laboratory supervisor or infection control, however the hospital has the system set up, would have to call the State Board of Health and say, hey, this person, well, first they would send the sample to the State Board of Health and say, hey, this patient has a positive RPR, so they could have syphilis. So the State Board of Health would do the confirmation test, and then they would take care of contacting the patient and making sure that they had taken their treatment and notified any possible other contacts. So I want to show you this link to the website here. And this is the whole long list of diseases. There's anthrax, botulism, brucellosis, measles, pertussis. There's so many. So here's the list that would be reported to the State Board of Health.